Hello, my name is Chris Wolff, and I'm the General Merchandise Manager at the UMKC bookstore. I'm also UMKC's historian. My recent book, A Pearl of Great Value, documented UMKC's histories from its beginning as a small liberal arts college to today's status as a major research university. Today we're going to talk about a story that didn't make it into the book. We're going to talk about what is arguably the most haunted place in Kansas City, the Epperson House. This is the home of Uriah and Mary Elizabeth Epperson. Uriah Epperson was manager of a packing house here in Kansas City, and after he retired, he started up his own insurance company and quickly became one of Kansas City's wealthiest men. And he and his wife decided to build a colossal mansion on the corner of 52nd and Cherry Street. Legend has it that the famous French architect Horace Lapierre showed them plans for over 1,500 houses before they settled on this, a curious mixture of Tudor and Gothic styles with 54 rooms that Mrs. Epperson quickly labeled Epperson's Folly. The house took 3 years to complete and included craftsmen from Europe that they had to bring over to carve walnut paneling in the inside and oak banisters and railings on the staircases inside the house. And after 3 years, once the landscaping was put in and the home was taking its finishing steps, Mrs. Epperson fell in love with it, and she called it Hawthorne Hall. Now, there was 54 rooms in this house, and there was just the two of them. But the Eppersons had a friend that they had met through one of their charities. They supported the Kansas City Conservatory of Music, and there they met a professor of organ named Harriet Barse. And Harriet didn't have any family, and so the Eppersons decided to ask her to move in with them. And they invited her into their social circle, and they dubbed her their adopted daughter. Now, in 1922, the Eppersons were getting ready to move into the home, and they had commissioned an organ loft in the living room, and Harriet was going to have a giant organ and was going to entertain the guests to the Eppersons' parties. And before they could move into the home, Harriet fell ill, and she was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital, and it was discovered she had a infected gallbladder. And so she was rushed to surgery, and there she died on the operating table. Now, the Eppersons were, of course, devastated by Harriet's loss. She was the closest thing to a child that they had ever had. But life must go on. And so the Eppersons moved on with their lives, supported their charities. And about this same time, Mr. Epperson decided to sell his business to his business partner, a man named James Lynn. And James Lynn also purchased the Eppersons' home and told them, "You can live in it as long as you want, but upon your death, I'll take ownership of the home." And they agreed to his terms. And they lived here for several years. And then in 1927, Mr. Epperson died of a stroke here in the home. Mrs. Epperson continued their legacy of charitable giving, gave away a lot of money to various charities. There's an Epperson auditorium over at the Kansas City Art Institute that she gifted, along with much money to causes such as the Kansas City Philharmonic Orchestra. And in 1939, Mrs. Epperson died of cancer here in the home as well. The home reverted to the ownership of Mr. Epperson's business partner, Mr. James Lynn, who happened to be on the board of trustees of the University of Kansas City, which was right next door to the home. And so in 1942, Mr. Lynn decided to donate the Epperson House to the university. And this was during the Second World War, and the university had some Army and Navy flight cadets here studying at the university. And they decided that they would turn the Epperson House into a rooming house for those Navy flight cadets. And it was during that time that the Navy cadets were here that there were the first reports of seeing a ghostly female figure in a ball gown here in the home. Well, after the war, the home was turned into the university's first residence hall. And then in 1956, it became home to the School of Education. And then later, in the 1970s, it became home to the Conservatory of Music, who used the home for practice space for students as well as offices. And it was during the 1970s that the stories of Epperson House really began to take on a life of their own. So in the 1970s, when the conservatory had moved into the Epperson House, a lot of weird stories started coming out of the home. Students would see a ghostly figure in a white dress, as if dressed for a recital. They'd be by themselves in the house, and they could hear footsteps coming down a hallway or on the floor above. Lights would flicker on and off for no reason, including lights up in the tower up above, which had been walled off since the 1950s. The Eppersons originally had a swimming pool in the basement. When the School of Education was here, it was boarded over and that space was turned into a classroom. Students sitting in that classroom swear they could hear the sound of splashing coming from under the floor as if somebody was drowning. And then, of course, there was the sound of organ music that would come up from out of the basement, always the organ music. Now, the students would often go to the campus police and they would complain, the house is haunted, we're scared to go in there. And the chief of police, Harvey Cottle, would laugh them off and say, it's an old house, it's got old wiring, just settling, making weird noises. You're letting your imagination, run wild. Well, when one of the chandeliers in the living room broke free and almost struck one of the custodians, now a lot of the campus staff started believing. And they would go to the chief of police, who would say, you're letting the kids get to you. Their imagination is running wild, and now they're affecting you. It's just an old house, it's settling. There's nothing going on. Well, this would change when Chief Cottle's, one of his officers, would come to the Epperson House in the middle of the night one night. The dispatcher had received a call that somebody was screaming inside of the home. So in the middle of the night, the officer pulled up in the driveway behind the house and went in the home and went through each room and turned on the lights, looked throughout the home. There was nobody there. So he got back into his car and he was sitting in his car writing up his report, when suddenly another car ran up the driveway and rammed into the back of his collision. And he shook and he was startled and he immediately grabbed his flashlight, jumped out of the car and checked on the other driver. He hopped out of the car, but there was no other car and there was no other driver. And he's rubbing his neck and he's thinking, this is crazy. Am I going insane? He starts shining his flashlight along the ground, looking for broken pieces of glass or metal or plastic, something to show that he's not losing his mind. And he can see where his police cruiser has been shoved up 8 inches from the skid marks on the driveway. And so now he believed. 2 years later, that same officer and another officer respond to a call from Epperson House in the middle of the night. Somebody's screaming inside the home. So both officers come into the home and they go through each room by room. They turn on the lights, they look around. There's nobody there. The house is empty. And so they're coming out the front door. And the first officer from the Phantom crash comes out first. The second officer is right on his heels. And he's coming out the entryway, out the front door. And he goes to turn the light switch off. And the light won't turn off. Well, that's not surprising. This house was built in the early 20s. There's old wiring in here. And he figures, I'll just leave it on and I'll call the maintenance crew tomorrow and they can come and fix it. And so as he's heading out the front door, he turns to shut the front door, looking into that entryway where the light is on. And he sees a ghostly arm in a blue suit coat reach around the corner and it flips the light off. And so now he believes. So this forevermore has become the story, the urban legend of what really happened at Epperson House.